Okay. All right, thank you very much for coming out today. I know this is a really busy time in the semester, so I appreciate the time you have to share with me. This project is a joint project. It's a book project with Sean McKenna, who's a pediatrician at MCV. And we're doing a book on children's health and what it's like to be a pediatrician. And so we have a whole chapter devoted to the pediatric obesity epidemic. And many of you in this room, I'm sure, have firsthand knowledge of this. You're very knowledgeable of this epidemic, so I hope that you will jump in the Q&A period and take over that part. My talk today has 3 parts to it, just like a good 3-part sermon or a 3-part play. I'm going to start off with just all the facts that we have at a certain point in this conversation, the same knowledge about how much this phenomenon has increased in the last generation, where it's concentrated, who has it disproportionately, all the facts about the epidemic. The second part is a survey of the things that we think, based on our research and other people's research, are the leading causes of the epidemic. And then trying to end on a more optimistic note, although I'll be honest at the very beginning, if you look at the data as much as we have, first closely as we have, you want to remain optimistic, but it's hard to be optimistic right now. The data doesn't suggest that we have a lot to be optimistic about, but there are things we are trying. There are some programs and interventions and policies that are showing some fruits. So that's the structure of the talk. How big is the epidemic and how much has it increased in the last generation or two? Well, if you look at the last 35 years, the number of children who are clinically obese, it's increased 3 to 4-fold. And it's been across the spectrum, the very young kids, 2 to 5-year-olds, 6 to 11-year-olds, and then the teenagers. The most recent data that's just coming in right now shows that we are now reaching the 20% threshold. 1 in 5 children are above the 30th BMI cut point, and that compares to when I was a kid, 1975, I was 5 years old, it was 1 in 20. And so there are very few areas of human development over time that you see this large of an increase. So it's definitely there, it's definitely real, and it's definitely disconcerting. It's not across the board, it's not equally prevalent in all sectors of society. For boys, teenage boys, it's disproportionately increasing in Mexican Americans, and among girls, it's hitting the hardest in the African American community. All demographics are seeing increases, but you do see areas where it's increasing more significantly. Oops. Again, it's also all across the United States, but there are some parts of the United States where the increase is really dramatic. And right now, if you want to look at the place that has the biggest increase, it's in the Deep South. And I always kind of, not trying to pick on the Baptists, but if you keep looking at the maps of where all of the concentrations are the highest, it happens to be the Deep South in places where Baptists are greatest in number. As you do this research, and as I do it all the time, I sit there and I pore over data sets and maps and trend lines. I always try to come back to a couple of slides that I show in my class, Emma's been in one in Peru, about trying to put the human dimension on this research, because all of the massive amounts of data that we go over, they're all aggregations of individuals. And I try to remember that because this really impacts a lot of people in a really profound way. Apart from children who have asthma, and they're basically at the same level, no other specific group of kids misses more school than children who are clinically obese. And they miss school because of health issues that arise related to the obesity. The big one that we found is that they have a lot of mental health issues. A lot of these kids are picked on, and they have depression and anxiety, so they miss a lot of school. As an aside, our kids just finished reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory at school at Tuckahoe. The first child to go is Augustus. He's the first one. And so I don't think that was an accident. This is a truism that I try to impart to my students. It's never in human history been easier to become obese. At the same time, it's never been harder to be obese. And I always show this one little brief clip that most of my students never forget about how this hits people on an individual level. Let me show this to you real quick.
I hope in your entire life you never need the courage that I need just every day to get up and get out the door.
Prejudice begins at a very early age. In a London primary school, 24 children between the ages of 5 and 8 are given a test that was first used in an important American study of children's attitudes. 4 photographs are handed out to every member of the class. They show a child in a wheelchair, a child who has lost her hair through cancer treatment, a child from a nation they would have had no contact with, and a fat child.
And what you've got to do is you've got to choose one which you wouldn't like to be your friend as much as the other 3. Don't show anyone else.
You can't do this with adults. You can't do this kind of study with adults because they won't answer the question. As you get older, you get socialized not to say these things, but what you can do with children is get the primeval response.
Once you've got that one person that you don't want to be your friend, bring it up and put it on the table up here.
The most unpopular child by far, earning more rejections than the other three put together, was the child who is fat.
Why did you decide, Stacey, that you didn't want that little boy as your friend?
Because he's fat. Because he was too fat. Because he was too fat.
Well, what are fat people like, Joshua?
Lazy.
We have made fat shameful. And it's a cruel paradox that the ideal of physical beauty is becoming progressively thinner at the very time when there are more and more reasons and inducements for people to put on weight.
It's crazy, Maggie. People are bombarded with messages. Eat this, eat this, eat this, eat. Whether it's good or bad, eat. And then on the other hand, they're told, be healthy, don't eat.
Sorry. There we go. We'll revisit that documentary at another time. So it exacts a huge psychological toll on children. And this came out in the data that we've looked at. Across the board, children who are obese have much higher health issues. The one that stands out are the behavioral health visits. It's threefold increase in children who are not obese. So this has a huge impact. The other area that you see a greater increase of is diabetes. Over the last 15 years, the number of people who are diabetic have increased by 100%. And you can see, again, there are areas of the country where this dynamic is playing out in a bigger way, and it's, again, in the Deep South. It's not just children, obviously. This phenomenon is across the board. It's happening to adults as well, and you see a doubling over the last generation of people who are meeting this clinical criteria. And Jenny Burnett had this slide in her presentation. If you look at back 20 years ago, it was about 15 to 19% would have been the highest. We didn't even have a state that had that level yet. And now Colorado has that, and it's the lowest. And again, this is in 20 years. So this is a really big, massive phenomenon in a very short amount of time. It's not just people. This is an article in the recent Wall Street Journal that even veterinarians are seeing that a half of their clientele are reaching the clinical criteria threshold as well. So it's not just children. That's the big message at this point in the conversation. It's a phenomenon that's massive, that is beyond some people's individual control genetically and in terms of their environment, and it's across the board. Now, for public health researchers, and nice to see Jennifer Palazzolo here, who's working in this field. This is a map also I show my students who want to go into health, medical humanities, and public health. This is the first time you've ever had this in U.S. history apart from one other era. All these areas that are red and pink are counties, there's about 180 of them, in which life expectancy has plateaued in the pink and is now literally declining as people are living less long than their parents. The only other time you ever see this in human history, and the only time you saw it in U.S. history, was in the 19-teens, 1918, 1919. We had a massive flu epidemic. It wiped out 600,000 people. So apart from a massive communicable outbreak of a disease, you don't see this. But we are seeing this now. First time in U.S. history, we have people in counties who are, at the poorest part, they're living 25 to 35 years less than people who live in the healthiest counties. So we have this massive divergence in the U.S. population. When you break out this map into gender, you see that it's disproportionately female. It's only about 11 counties where this is happening to men. The vast majority is happening to women. Women are having higher rates of smoking, higher rates of high blood pressure, and obesity. So what's the risk? Well, one of the big concerns is that you are higher risk for mortality. And for men, it's particularly increased. And I remember, no, this is in seriousness. He died of a heart attack related to his health issues. So that's one of the contributing factors to why some of those areas are red. You have higher rates of obesity in those red areas. Okay, so that's the overview of how big this epidemic is, where it's concentrated, how much it's increased over time. Now we get to the culprits. What are the things that are making this happen? What are the causes? And this is where I have to be really humble and modest because I've gone over this a lot. It's a really complex interaction of a number of factors. And as social scientists, usually your instinct is to take a phenomenon, break it apart into its component factors as individual things, and then figure out what the weight is for each one. Is it more of this, more of that? But people who work in this field and are knowledgeable say that you can do that scientifically, but in the real world it doesn't work that way. These things interact, and you can't separate them. One impacts the other very, very closely. But one of the big factors that comes up are food prices. Now, a lot of food prices have gone up. Fruits and vegetables and real inflation-adjusted prices have gone up in recent years. But processed foods, refined carbohydrates have gone significantly down. And so that's what's more available, and we've just gone through a recession where millions of people have had to really, really try to get by on reduced income, and their food budget's one of the first things they have to address. They're not able to afford as much of the healthy stuff, and they have to buy more of the stuff that's unhealthy. Related to that, again, economics and poverty, 20% of children in the most recent surveys now live under the poverty threshold. And they disproportionately live in poor neighborhoods. And if you come from a poor neighborhood, some areas of North Richmond, Churchill, these are people that have basically live in food deserts. They don't have vehicles. There's not a supermarket in the area that sells wholesome food. And some of these areas are not safe for the kids to go out and play. So you have this conglomeration of factors. The kids are eating more unhealthy food, and they can't get out to play as much. The parents are actually being very responsible in keeping their children in to keep them safe, but in so doing, they're eating less healthy food, they're more prone to become asthmatic, and they're eating less healthy food. Which leads to the last point. All of us, myself included, are wrestling with increased caloric intake. All of us now have more access to more food, some of it good, but more of it is not healthy for us. For children, what's the big thing that they eat a lot more now than they used to? It's chips, candy, and the big one of all, the biggest enemy in this entire epidemic is sugary drinks. Vending machines are in 21% of elementary schools, so it's not common, but it's there. It's the rare middle school and high school that doesn't have a vending machine. And soda is where you really get the big intake of sugars and refined carbohydrates. They get on average now an extra 360 calories a day from these items, and it only costs $1. These things in real inflation-adjusted dollars haven't gone up very much at all. Where do we see this on a personal level with my students? As part of the Sophomore Scholars and Learning Program, we take 2 trips for the Global Health Group. We do one, we've gone to Peru, we've gone to the Dominican Republic to look at health needs there. But one of the main messages to impart is that there's massive health needs here. You don't have to leave the country to get involved in healthcare. So our children's mental health group goes to New York. That's a 6-hour trip to the north. If you go 6 hours due west, you come to the town of Grundy that every October over fall break, Remote Area Medical has a medical clinic that's free and a dental clinic that's free. And we go volunteer there for the weekend. And I remember the first time we went with students, we all assumed based on what we had read and on documentaries, we'd be doing a lot of primary health care. When we got there, this is what we saw the vast majority of. It was kids and adults. We probably spent 90% of our time assisting in the dental clinic. That's where the real pressure and stress was. We saw a lot of this. Now, I'll just confess, the first time I saw this, the first thing that came out of my mind was a very judgmental response, which is somebody is not parenting very well, someone is not exercising personal responsibility. This is clearly someone who's, and when we do the background check, the survey says, what's your main liquid supply? Is it well water, is it county water, or other? And what we kept seeing on the other more and more was soda. And this is what you get when you drink a lot of soda. So initially you think they're not brushing their teeth, they're not drinking fluoridated water, they're drinking a lot of soda, this is bad. If you dig a little deeper, as 2 of my students did, they went back there over spring break to do research, Chad Krieger and Jack Wisniewski. And they're both from that area. Jack's from Roanoke and Chad's from West Virginia. They spent a whole week doing research, and they found out that it's not so much parental lack of responsibility. In that area of the country, there's so much mining runoff that the actual water supply is not safe to consume. It would give them serious health problems, so they have to find an alternative liquid supply. And then when they went to the local grocery store to price out what the alternatives were, by far the cheapest is soda. Bottled water is expensive, especially in this area. So soda is the most inexpensive thing that they can consume. And this is a microcosm of how difficult it is to address this issue. And the instinctive response is to say people should just be personally responsible. Sometimes they should be, but sometimes they're in situations, especially when they're children, where it's not possible. And these are the students. Again, we went down there thinking it was going to be all healthcare. We spent all day in the dental clinic. And a lot of the children who had the dental issues also had obesity issues. And as we pulled their teeth, which we had to do in many instances, they were now less able to eat healthy foods that require healthier teeth. They need to eat more processed food. So it's a kind of a vicious cycle. All right, take a break. I've been lecturing a lot. You don't have to close your eyes to do this. I can't do this, Emma. This doesn't work in my classes anymore. They're like, we weren't thinking. We weren't even born yet. But I think most of you in this room were. I know where I was. I was actually in Wood Hall, October 1989. Where were you guys in October 1989? Anybody remember? All right. At the time that this massive change in the fast food industry took place, nobody really took notice of it. I know I didn't. It took about a decade for us to realize how important this was. In October 1989, Wendy's was trying to catch up to the major fast food companies, in particular the biggest competitors, McDonald's. And Wendy's has always had a reputation for being higher quality and higher prices, so if you just didn't want to quite slum it, you go to Wendy's. But that meant they were always missing out on a market share, people who had even more limited means but would buy fast food. So they created what they called at the time a value menu meal. Everything's $1. Phenomenally successful. I mean, their sales skyrocketed. Now, Wendy's didn't like or appreciate the fact that it put enormous economic pressure on their business model, because to actually provide that food at $1 means the profit margin is incredibly thin. So they tried to get rid of it a year later. Their customers revolted and said, bring back the value menu. So they brought it back. It's been a staple ever since. And then when they did that, all the other fast food companies that they wanted to compete with Wendy's had to move to a value menu meal. Now, I personally, in college, I ate that a lot. I don't eat that a lot now. Okay, so sometimes I have to remind myself that there are literally millions of people that this is their primary food supply because they have limited means, and this has had a tremendous impact on the rates of obesity. It's not a one-to-one ratio. It's a tight correlation. It's not one-to-one. But places where you have higher rates of consumption of that food also tend to be places, not surprisingly, that are higher in poverty. These really dark areas are counties in which the poverty rate below the poverty threshold is between 1/3 to 2/3. If you just look at these areas that are, this is Appalachia, this is Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, Southwest Virginia, this is the Deep South, Indian reservations out here, you can see that this is the highest rates of poverty, highest rates of obesity, highest rates of diabetes across the board. And these are areas where they have the term now is food deserts, where these are counties in which you have a proportion of the population that has no car and they're beyond a mile from the supermarket. And you have places where over 10% of the population meets that criteria. And so that really complicates the personal responsibility argument because they literally, physically cannot do that. We also take students to New York and we stay on the upper, where's Kay? Thank you, Kay. She's able to actually house us on the Upper West Side. Sometimes the hotels are a little interesting. But they're not food deserts. We're surrounded by healthy food options. But we take most of our students up into the Harlem Children's Zone to visit the KIPP charter schools in the Harlem. This is basically the Harlem Children's Zone right here. And when we walk through there, it's just a night and day difference. You don't have the Starbucks and you don't have the fresh markets and the Whole Foods. You have a lot of this stuff. And my wife and I, we go to church over in Church Hill and in the city, and it's like basically going there. I mean, it's an absolute food desert. So what's in abundance are liquor stores, fast food stores, convenience stores, and fast food, but you don't have places that are really affordable and that are healthy. How about genetics? Genetics play a huge part. And I always make sure to have this slide in there because you have to remind yourself, how big is the genetic role in our size? Really interesting research project to tease this out. Claude Bouchard took about, I think it was 100 men, similar body shape, size, as much as he could control for, put them onto a university, sealed down the dorm, and for over 100 days he overfed them 1,000 calories 6 days a week to see what the average weight gain would be. So he was trying to control the environment as much as he could to tease out the genetic role. Average weight gain for this group of people, not surprisingly, 18 pounds. That was the not surprising part. This was the part that showed people genetics is a huge part. The range of the people. Some people only gain 9 pounds, eating the same amount of food extra. Other people gain 26 pounds. So there are people who genetically, they eat the same amount as myself, for instance, are going to gain a lot more than I'm going to gain. They have a different genetic makeup. One of the newest theories coming out, the social networking analysis that looks at how obesity spreads in clusters. Okay, and this is the pioneers of this research, Nicholas Christakis, he's a doctor, and James Fowler, one of our students is working with him out at UC San Diego, one of our poli-sci students. Jamie Settle's out there working. They have a really pioneering form of research. They have this data set from Framingham, Massachusetts. It's longitudinal. It looks over about 2,000 people over 60 years, and it measures all of their vital information, plus, this was the kicker, who their best friends were, so that you could actually link them up over time to see if one person becomes obese in a network of friendships, what is the likelihood someone else around them is going to become obese? And it's actually hugely significant. So back in 1985, about 20% of the Framingham population was obese, and even here they're kind of clustering somewhat. Fast forward to 2000, it's about 40%, And having a friend who becomes obese increases your likelihood of becoming obese by 171%. I mean, it's almost like a fait accompli. Now, some people look at this, and there's a lot of different competing hypotheses for why that might be. But the reason why I believe in this somewhat to a lot is I'm the SSIR director. So I get to kind of see my own little controlled experiments on campus in terms of housing. Most of the students that work in the program I have are in Freeman and they're in Lakeview, which is the Four Seasons hotels on our campus. They are beautiful, they are pristine. You walk in there on Friday night, people are nerding out studying. They might have music on. I'm exaggerating a little bit. You never see damage to the exit signs. You don't see any of the stuff you see in Marsh and Southcourt. In part, and this is not just for the students who are in the program, it's for students who come back from abroad and they get placed in there. The whole aura is that this is a nerdy place. It's unacceptable to be out of control in this building. You're going to change your behavior in this room. In fact, the peer pressure is to study. So everybody comes back, and if you're not studying immediately, you feel guilt that you're not studying, which is a good thing. We want them to feel that. A little bit. But your environment and the people around you very much dictate the parameters of what you think is normal and acceptable. So if you're in an area where that kind of outrageous behavior is normal, it's more common. And this is true for all kinds of, it's true for moods, it's true for behaviors as well. This is, having said all this is another humility slide. Daniel Kahneman, he's a psychologist at Princeton. It's called the focusing illusion. He says, nothing in life is as important as you think it is while you're thinking about it. I'll try to remember this. What does he mean by this? He says, take the example of income and education. We all think that more education will increase people's income. A lot is our sort of assumption. If you actually break out all the people who have PhDs or MDs or JDs and look at the range of income, it's massive. So we're always tempted to say, well, if we could just change physical activity, or if we could just change sugar alone, it would have a massive impact. But when you actually run the data, you end up seeing that no, any one factor doesn't have that. They all have an impact, but they don't have as big an impact because they all interact with one another. So the final part of the talk is, well, what can we do to try to address some of these things, to be responding to the epidemic? Number one, prohibit all advertising of unhealthy food to kids. I would love that. Not going to happen in the United States of America. It is done in the UK, Norway, and Sweden. It's illegal to advertise these foods to kids. So it is possible. It's not beyond the realm of possibilities. Countries that have some similarity to us to do it, but if I had to bet money, I would bet we'll never do that. Subsidized production and sale of fruits and vegetables. This is another sort of NPR, New York Times recommendation. Love it. I'm in sympathy with it. It's wonderful. I don't know if it's going to happen. End subsidies to corn, because that's where a lot of the carbohydrates end up coming from. It'd be a great idea. I don't think it's going to happen. Increase physical activity, decrease the number of food deserts, lower poverty. Again, these are all things that would be wonderful, but not necessarily likely to happen really quickly. Let me show you what has been tried in about 10 states with mixed results. Let's see what you guys think of this. Okay.
I'm Jody Cantor for the New York Times. There are lots of potential solutions to the childhood obesity epidemic in this country. School cafeteria menus are being revamped, physical education programs are being expanded and improved, but there's also a new kind of letter sent home from school these days. Lots of people call them obesity report cards, although the official name is a BMI report, a body mass index report. One of the problems with fighting childhood obesity is that there are some kids who have the exact opposite problem. They don't eat enough. Carlin Dunbar is one of those kids. Like every other kid in her district, she got a BMI letter home in the mail, and even though her weight is in the normal range, she panicked when she read it, and as a result, as you see in this picture, she'll no longer eat her dinner. Carlin's mother says that Carlin doesn't know who to believe. Should she believe her mom, who's begging her to eat more, or should she believe the school, which Carlin is convinced thinks she's overeating? Carlin is in the minority in southern Tioga County. There's a significant obesity problem there. Most of the restaurants are chain stores. As you can see, Pudgy's is a pizza parlor, but what you can't see is that it's also a convenience store. So it's like eating in a 7-Eleven. Southern Tioga County is an isolated place. It's not near any major city. And in its isolation, it's evolved its own standards. Holly Bergeson really epitomizes this community's attitude towards weight. She's the homecoming queen, and the community is very proud of the fact that it elected a size 20 homecoming queen who isn't the typical slender blonde cheerleader. Holly is an athlete. She's really involved in all sorts of school sports, but she's also a size 20 and she's insulin resistant. What Cassie Allen says is that kids who are slightly overweight don't like the fact that she's on the thin side, and they tease her. They tell her she's anorexic. They ask her to please eat something. Most of us don't need a number to know whether we need to gain or lose weight. So you have to wonder if the real controversy here, the real source of pain and frustration for the community, are the letters themselves or simply the frustration of being overweight. One student said to me, I don't need a BMI letter to tell me that I'm overweight. All I have to do is look in the mirror. For the New York Times.
For a lot of people, this does help them sort of initiate a conversation with their doctor, but for a lot of people, they're deeply offended, and they think this is not within the jurisdiction of what the school should be doing. They should be focusing on education, not doing health. What is if you talk to most policy experts, if you could only do one thing that might have the biggest impact, most of them agree that this would be the best thing to do, is put a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages, 1 cent per ounce. And what is it that they're building their confidence off of on this? Well, first of all, it's the biggest contributor to obesity. This is an interesting graph that showed cigarette taxes and cigarette consumption. This was the consumption of cigarettes over the last 40 years, and this is the rate at which they were taxed and how much it cost. It was increasing in the 1980s, and then in November 1998, there was a master settlement agreement between the tobacco companies and about, I forgot the number, 30 states' attorneys general. They were basically suing them for recoupment of Medicaid costs for treating people who had smoked. The cigarette company said, if we pay you all $206 billion over the course of 25 years, will you exempt us from any future litigation? And they said yes. So they had to raise $206 billion over the next 25 years, and they did it by massively increasing taxes in most states. Not in Virginia, because we're Virginia. But it absolutely had a huge impact over time, especially when that increase in cigarette taxes went up, consumption of cigarettes went down. So there is a responsiveness to price. If you increase prices of something, sometimes they're inelastic, but sometimes they're elastic and they do respond. And at least with cigarettes, there was a good response. Here's the problem, and Dan can appreciate this. It very much depends on how you frame this. So if you just say, should the government improve the nutrition of food in schools? 92% say yes. I don't know who these 4.4% people are, but they're just contrarian. That's fine. Now, if you say the government should do this, even if it requires raising taxes, you just lost 20% of the people who originally supported you. If you're really honest and you start your sentence by saying the government should raise taxes in order to improve the nutrition, now you don't have a passing majority. So the way you phrase it is really enormously powerful. And if you're going to take the lesson from this, is just be dishonest and do it. Don't tell them. But that's not taken very well. So we can't do that. But it's the reality. It's why sometimes it's good to live in a dictatorship. Clearly. It's going to be a lot harder to address obesity than tobacco. And right above us is one example. This is, my son always laughs at this, Ben. He's like, that is really a sad, lonely little fruit stand. That's our fruit offerings upstairs, okay? And half of it's usually not ready to eat at that point. It's really green and it's just not ripe enough yet. This is what we have a ton of upstairs. Now, we don't have a huge issue on campus. One of the issues we have on campus is a lot of bulimia and anorexia, so we have the opposite distortion of our relationship to food. But we also our university, I didn't bring every time you go to the pier, I'm basically marketing Coke for the rest of the day of my little Coke thing. I mean, we have a relationship with Coke that's exclusive, and Coke doesn't want to see us reduce our intake of sugar-sweetened beverages. They want that to increase. So I don't think we sell cigarettes on campus, do we? Do we sell it in the Et Cetera store? Yeah. We sell it?
I think Et Cetera sells it.
Okay. I was kind of hoping for the sake of the story that we weren't selling cigarettes.
I don't think they sell it.
All right, I'm going to go with... Yeah, can we get I'm going to go with we don't until someone says authoritatively we do. We do sell cigarettes?
ETC.
All right. It would have been a better story if they didn't. That's all right. Any rate, it's a lot easier to sort of marginalize tobacco. You can't do that with food. It's not as possible. Last slide. What will work eventually, besides a dictatorship? What doesn't go over well with a large segment of the U.S. population is you're going to have to get very nanny-ish and invasive of people's privacy, invasive of their personal lives. So, for an example, this is the whole genre of literature about choice architecture, how you set up choices. So one way of doing this is take the dessert thing upstairs and get rid of it. Replace it with fruit. And then have cookies somewhere in the dining hall, but don't specify where. And then say, yeah, we do have it. If you insist that we get it out, we'll get it out for you. But if you make it harder for people to get at things, they'll consume less of it. If you make it easier to get to fruits, they'll consume more of that. But it means you'd have to be much more involved in setting up people's choices. So apart from that, the individual interventions that say to people, be more personally responsible, can only have a very limited effect. And as Jenny mentioned in her research last time, it's really hard, and I can speak from personal experience, it's really hard to lose weight, really hard to keep weight off. And if you rely on people doing that, you're going to fail. What you have to do is you have to change their whole environment. But then again, that requires the government or the university or somebody else and above you to change the life around you. And this is America, and we generally don't like to have people messing with our individual choices. So that's the end of my presentation, and I really welcome many of you all to take over this part of the program and lead with Q&A. So thank you very much for listening.